And we pick up at chapter 6. Ice Cube. Hassan woke to the sounds of camp. The air was warm and smoky, filled with familiar scent of roasting meats and herbs burned for incense. He could hear a low murmur of voices around him, but his ears felt stuffed with wool, and he had difficulty focusing his eyes. A dull ache filled the left side of his head. When he attempted to move, it grew to a stabbing pain. "Take it slow," he heard Dern mutter nearby. It was difficult to tell for certain, but as he escaped the fog enveloping his mind, things grew clearer. A cool compress pressed against the tender part of his head, and he flinched. It tingled as the discomfort receded. "Where am I?" Hassan's throat was dry, and he coughed from the attempt. The stabbing pain in his head returned with a vengeance. He winced and brought his hand up to cover the injury, but a gentle grasp restrained him. Something warm dabbed at his wound. Its effervescent smell made his eyes water, and for a second it burned horribly. The sting vanished almost as quickly as it rose, and carried the stabbing pain, and in fact all sensation on that part of his scalp with it. "There, that should do it," Dern's voice intruded once more, and Hassan felt the same tender touch bandage his wound. "How is your sight? Are you able to see me yet?" Hassan opened his eyes once more. Now that the pain had subsided, the old man's smiling face looked down at him with concern. "Yes, a little. It's still a bit fuzzy, but it's getting better." He attempted to sit up, and a new pain assaulted him as the muscles protested. "Careful now," Dern cautioned. "Your head took the brunt of the damage from that rock, but your body got beat up when you fell, too. Pretty long drop from Ilewa's back, and there was nothing but stone to cushion your landing." Dern placed his hands behind Hassan's back. "Here, let me help you sit up." Hassan felt the extent of the bruising as he leveraged into a sitting position. It wasn't as piercing as the head's injury, but it was going to take him a moment to adapt. As he gazed around, he answered his earlier question for himself. He was back within the Concho Gall. He was back with the Concho Gall bundled up in one of the corners of the Grand Hall. It was a familiar sight that soothed his emotions after the tumultuous evening. A fire crackled in the center, casting its warmth and light throughout the large, hidebound structure. Women gathered around the fire, storing pots and readying ingredients as they prepared a meal for the tribe. Children played in small groups on the edges of the activity, diligently watched out of the corners of their cook's eyes. There were a few men on the outskirts, mending equipment or tossing a game of bones, but there was noticeable absence of the tribe's male members. In a more permanent camp, the Grand Hall would be extensively furnished with tapestries and benches, lamps and cushions, everything that made the Concho Gall feel at home. But since we were on the move, those luxuries remained loaded. Instead, the large commons were sparsely adorned with rugs to soften the hard ground, and the sleeping mats currently rolled neatly along the leather walls. Beyond those necessities, very little else filled the space. When only the Grand Hall was erected, they needed all the room available to contain the entirety of the tribe. "What happened?" Hassan asked, still a little disoriented. "You were struck by flying debris. Rather large rock, actually. You're lucky to be alive." "We're all lucky." "Good thing it happened right outside of camp. So it's over?" It seemed a silly question, as Hassan didn't hear the horrible howling of the winds overhead, but knowing it was finished gave him a sense of relief. "How long did it last?" 2 days. 2 days!" Hassan exclaimed, then broke into another fit of coughing. The outburst drew the attention of the women cooking at the fire, but Dern motioned that all was okay. He hastily filled a metal cup from a pitcher he had warming in a small pot of coals next to him. The steaming contents had a noxious odor and a sickly green hue. "Here, drink this. It will soothe your throat and some of your other pains. You've been out for some time. You could use the fluids." Hassan stared at the cup with trepidation, but eventually gave in and brought it to his lips. It was more out of a desire to drink something than an eagerness to taste whatever foul concoction Dern cooked up. It wasn't as horrid as he imagined, but the pungent smell still offended his nose. Thankfully, it did as the old man said. His throat burned at first, but quickly relaxed with the influx of liquids, and after a few more sips the tension in his muscles unclenched. "Thanks, that helps." Hassan stretched to test the extent of his injuries. There were a few twinges of pain, but the concoction seemed to be dampening their effects. "So what have I missed? Where is everybody?" "Quite a bit, actually. With your health in question and inability to travel, I was able to convince your father to hold up here, but that, unfortunately, didn't prevent him from bringing new problems upon us." "He went before the council already, didn't he?" The resignation in Hassan's voice made clear he already knew the answer. "I had barely concluded your well-being before he called the meeting. I hate suggesting it, but I suspect he hoped to bypass any argument by holding the council meeting before you were even awake." He worked the entire camp into a frenzy over what happened in Anhara. The only voice of reason besides my own was Cho'Gah. Although he showed little resistance to your father the moment I voiced support, he backed down. All he asked was that your father remain behind with a few guards. The news brought clarity regarding the men's absence. Those who remained were laborers or either too young or too old and infirm to fight. There wasn't a single warrior's face visible in the Grand Hall. He sent them back to the city. It was more statement than question. How many did he send? 40 spears left for Anhara as soon as the storm relented, Dern answered. That's almost every warrior we have, Asan exclaimed in a restrained whisper. Dern nodded. That was about the only part of this endeavor that Cho'Gah was willing to stand firm on in contention with your father. He argued that we must keep some defenders with the people, but in the end even that objection was overruled by your father and the council. We barely convinced him to stay behind with the few warriors we did. How long ago did they leave? Asan asked. Around sunset, yesterday. Asan knew there was little chance they could be recalled in time, let alone that he would be able to convince the council or his father to do so. Already his mind was calculating the distances, trying to estimate the soonest time they might return were they successful. But there would also be a time by which all hope was lost. Assuming there were no delays, and they rode through the night, they should have arrived by now. If they don't return by this evening, we can begin assuming the worst. If tomorrow comes with no return, this folly will be known for what it was. I suspect the Ka-Ra has come to the same conclusion, Dern replied. He's been in a foul mood since this morning, and it's grown worse as the day progresses. I think as matters stand right now, the least of our worries is my father's mood. Our people have been stripped of their protectors, and in doing so, that we very well may incite the wrath of Aasimar and bring his soldiers down upon us sooner. Even if they don't march into the highlands in pursuit, the second Briarcat is still lurking somewhere ahead. Dern looked questioningly at the last part, trying to discern if perhaps the head injury caused more damage than he expected. I'll explain outside, Asan answered the unspoken question. Help me up. I need to grab something to eat before I waste away. That concoction of yours has my insides burning, and I need to put something in it. Dern helped him to his feet and assisted him in getting dressed. As Asan belted his sword around his waist, he spoke to the old man in hushed tones. There are a few things I wish to see before this evening. When it becomes clear that our men are not returning, I suspect my ability to act will be limited by my father's pride and the council's fears. I need your help with some of it. I am always and have been at your service, young Ka, Dern replied deferentially. However, I must stress there are still those matters of which we discussed earlier that I must teach you. I feel they may be even more pertinent to current events than I suspected. I have plans for that as well, old man. Asan composed himself and proceeded to walk towards the cook fires as securely as possible, so as not to reveal the extent of his pain. All eyes turned as Asan approached. There was concern mirrored in some looks. The possible loss of the heir to the Khan Chagall must have worried them, especially considering a few of these women were mothers of eligible daughters. There were also glances that hid their judgment poorly, likely stemming from Asan's previous neglect and withdrawal from the tribe. With luck, he hoped to use one set of feelings to his advantage and mend the resentment of the other. He searched the faces, assessing the cataloging each one and how they viewed him. Dern taught him over the years that those with power must use all the tools available, and there was no greater tool than your own people. Asan needed support. He needed allies, and this simple act of seeking a meal was his first move on a game board much larger and more complex than anything he ever played as a child. He chose his target, planned his move, and acted. Nahima! Asan called to one of the women. She was one who held a grudge against his previous absence, although it mostly stemmed from his avoidance of her eligible and very eager daughter. Might a famished young cob request a bite to eat? An old man's concoctions are hardly adequate to sustain me so recently grown to manhood. But without a wife to see me through such an injury, an old man is the best I can expect. The prey was marked, the bait was set, and now all he needed was to lure her in. The look of judgment immediately melted from Nahima's mature yet pretty face. It was replaced by a beaming smile and a glint of cunning consideration in her eyes. She was the matriarch among this group of tribeswomen, and all present watched her reactions closely. She was the mother of the most eligible and also most highly sought-after daughter of the tribe, and the mention of this rise to manhood, as well as lack of a wife, was tailored to tug at her desire to see her family joined to the line of Ka-Ra. From her response, the hook was clearly set. Of course, my Ka, Nahima replied with as much deference as she could muster without appearing overtly so. We've only just begun a stew for the noon meal, but I'm sure we can prepare something worthy to sate you until then. No need to go out of your way, Asan responded. I have much to do today and little time to sit and eat. The peril of our people must be placed before the desires of my stomach. Perhaps some bread and dried meat to hold me over? If that is all you wish, Nahima conceded. Nisette! She called over her shoulder to the young girl standing quietly behind her. Your Ka requests food. See that he has all he desires. There was an inflection in her voice that spoke more than just of food. Yes, mother, a gentle voice responded. Nisette gave a flutter of her beautiful blue eyes to Hassan and a suggestive smile with her supple pink lips. Despite her youth and perceived innocence, she was equally interested in the potential pairing as her mother was, although for clearly different reasons. Every movement of her body as she collected the morsels had a flirtatious air about them, and her mother watched the entire performance approvingly. The other women looked on with mixed responses as they prepared the meal. Some, those with daughters of their own, watched with a tinge of jealousy. Peril to our people? One of the other women interjected. There was concern in her voice. However, seeing as she was the mother of the second most eligible daughter in the camp, her timing seemed more to draw Hassan's attention from Nisette's swaying hips than from any apparent fear. As I'm sure the council and my father made clear, strange events have transpired against the Conjugal in recent days. A great deal of preparation is needed to safeguard our people from any possible dangers that may follow. Certainly it's not as bad as it sounds, Nahima interjected. She was clearly irritated at the attention being drawn away from her daughter, but she seemed uncertain how to bring the matter back to where she wanted it. I hope that's true, Hassan countered. But 2 of our people are dead. Our warriors have gone to face an enemy we know little about. How many more may yet fall? Nisette's return was just the chance Nahima needed to return the conversation to her intended topic, and she took full advantage. Wonderful job, dear, she praised her daughter, then turned her attention back to Hassan. It's such a shame that in harsh times your duties interfere with the joys and experiences of youth. You two should be out enjoying your day, perhaps a walk together to enjoy the sun while we are camped here. There was an audible grunt of disapproval from the rival mother in response to these words, but before the women could confront each other, Hassan intervened. I would love nothing more to spend the day with a beautiful young lady. Hassan swiped the meat and bread from the plate in one swift motion. In fact, it's about time I began looking for the right girl to share my life with as Ka, wouldn't you say? There was an immediate glint of excitement as he acknowledged this fact, but he didn't give them a chance to savor his admission. Unfortunately, the current events mean I must put aside such domestic considerations until I have seen to the safety of the Conjugal. It's the only responsible choice. A communal sense of dismay overtook the group by the fire at his words. Nisette took it the hardest, as her sultry smile melted into a pout. Nahima was completely caught off guard, her face became uncomfortably pinched as she shifted on her feet uncertainly. It was clear she wanted to argue, but couldn't devise anything appropriate to say without offending Hassan, or endangering her daughter's chances. But it wasn't just those 2 who took it hard. Almost every woman in the cooking group seemed stunned by the sudden halt placed on their ambitions for their daughters. I share your dismay, Hassan responded to their mood, which is why I must hasten to set my plans in motion. With luck and the Council's blessing, of course, I'll be able to ensure our people's safety long enough to outdistance these threats. As long as everything goes as planned, I hope to see us arrive at the Dahara swiftly and without any more danger. It would be fitting, I think, if I had the difficult choice of a bride before all the clans of our people would we gather. Of course, that all rests on what I'm able to accomplish now. Hassan could see his words have the desired effect. The gentle malaise lifted as hope was restored. Already he could see the calculating and plotting going on in their cunning minds as they processed what they were just told and devised ways to use it to their advantage. Whether they realized it or not, their ambitions would unwittingly ally them to his cause, for the only way to get Hassan to choose one of their daughters as a bride was to ensure whatever plans he intended came to fruition. The downside to a mustache. We should probably be on our way, young Ka. Dern snatched a strip of meat from Hassan's hands. As you said, there is much to do with little more to do it. Then he stuffed the stolen morsel in his mouth and turned towards the exit. Thank you for the food, ladies, Hassan said, and gave an exaggerated bow. It wasn't an act the Conjugal traditionally used, but the unfamiliar flourish had its desired effect. The mothers and older women smiled at his manner, while the daughters blushed and giggled at his strange gesture. I must part, unfortunately, but I'll certainly return to see if the stew tastes anywhere near as wonderful as it smells. With that, Hassan spun around with a dramatic flare and exited the tent. He had to brace himself for a moment as he stepped from the grand hall into the bright sun. His body was still not back to normal after his injury, and his extravagant departure almost exceeded his current limits. He thanked whatever inner faculties allowed him to maintain his dignity and not collapse in front of those he worked so hard to manipulate, and then turned his attention to the food. I never realized you were so charming with the ladies, Dern approached to steal another slice of meat. Wherever did you learn such nonsense? From you, old man, Hassan laughed in between mouthfuls. Every time you get caught stealing food or drink, you flirt your way out of trouble with the same act. Same? Darren considered. Not quite, I'm much better at it. I would have managed to get us some bacon. Hassan could only laugh at that as Darren chuckled along. He tore a piece of the bread. Welcome in, Alexa. We're just discussing bacon, which is Darren's dinner of choice. Same, Darren considered. Not quite. I'm much better at it. I would have managed to get us some bacon. Hassan could only laugh at that as Darren chuckled along. He tore a piece off of the bread, then looked to his pupil. Very clever of you, I must say, dangling your bachelorship in front of them like that as a prize. But what prize do you want from them in return? Nahima is one of the biggest husband naggers there is, and her husband just happens to sit on the council. As I'm sure you know, if she decides she wants him to make a certain decision, she won't let him sleep until he does. I've heard my father comment that he wonders who really holds Dorshan's council seat, him or his wife. Her father sits on the council as well, Darren commented deductively, and he's wrapped around her finger too. Very well played. You've gained at least 2 sympathetic ears in the council with one act, Darren congratulated him. Actually 4, Hassan countered. Nahima isn't the only one who has both a relative on the council and a daughter they wish to marry off to me. I imagine everyone will be anxious to help me complete whatever plans I have in store, if only to speed up the chances. They'll eventually expect you to make good on that commitment, you know. I'll have to deal with that when the time comes. The Dahara is a long way off yet, and I need their help right now. And what is this grand plan you need the support of the council for? Hassan didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the surrounding camp as he presented that very question to himself. Just what did he really plan to do? His entire world had been thrown into chaos, and yet everything around him appeared so familiar and unchanged. Throughout the camp, his people went on with their same day-to-day activities. With the threat of the windstorm gone, there was no longer a need to shelter within the Grand Hall. Men walked picket lines caring for the horses, while others worked on repairing wagons or harnesses damaged in the storm. Children dashed around, tossing stones or climbing rocks. The sights and sounds of the Conchugal went about as if nothing were wrong. Yet in Hassan's mind, his thoughts screamed of danger. He wanted to call out to his brethren and warn them. He wanted to call them to arms to stand against the danger he sensed coming. But he had to be more subtle, if he had any chance of working within the confines of his father and the council. Honestly, Darren, I'm not completely sure, Hassan admitted. That act I pulled with Nahima was pure instinct. I know whatever I do, I'll need voices at my side to overcome my father's objections. Either way, I need to do something, because I fear my father isn't going to make the right decision when our men don't return from Anhara. You've already given up on them, then? Do you believe they stand a chance? Those soldiers were well armed. How many do you think could fit on those ships? Not to mention the Archbishop. Had he not intervened for whatever reason, I doubt we would have escaped. There's just too little chance our men will return. I hold out hope, but I have to go with my gut and prepare accordingly, Hassan replied. As much as I hate to admit it, I agree. But what do you intend to do? First things first, I need to figure out where my father is. If he sees me awake, it's going to be difficult to do anything, especially if he figures out I'm up to something. I have a few things to work out still, and I have to figure out how to approach a few people without running into him in the process. I need a safe place to do that. Darren smiled with a glint of cunning in his eyes and pointed up. You think you've recovered enough for a climb? As the blistering sun rose to its apex, Hassan and his aged companion scaled the large stone promontory that sheltered the Conchugal through the storm. They kept low against the windswept rock face to avoid detection and moved as quickly as their bodies would allow. Hassan struggled at first as his injured muscles protested at the strain, but as his body flexed and stretched with every movement, he loosened up and the aches and pains relented. Darren, on the other hand, scaled the pinnacle like a man decades younger, never hesitating as he hauled his scraggly form higher. The ascent benefited Hassan both mentally and physically. As this pain subsided, the familiar acts of hand over hand allowed his mind to drift off to matters that currently vexed him. He never truly took leadership seriously before this, and now that events transpired to force him to, he was insecure in his ability to act accordingly. His people were in danger. And even though he had a few vague plans coming together, he was unsure if he was truly capable of carrying them out. Defending his people would inevitably lead to killing others. The deaths of his fellow tribesmen bothered him greatly, but he dealt with other deaths of those close to him before. While those losses were hard to cope with, it was another death that plagued him. He killed another man. The reality of it was lost in the chaotic events following the battle in Anhara, but now that he was free from impending danger, it was coming back to haunt him. Hassan knew he had only killed out of self-defense. If he hadn't fought, he would either be dead or a prisoner of Azamir, but he still felt the man's blood upon his hands. He could remember clearly the soldier's last rattling breath. In the moment, he acted from instinct and training, vanquishing his foe with little thought as to what that act truly meant. But now that he was faced with the reality of that death, he wondered, would it be so easy a second time? Could he declare a death sentence as easily as he had upon Avar, despite the danger he knew he posed? Could he plunge his blade into another living soul, now that he could feel the emotional impact? If faced with another foe, would he hesitate? The thought shook his confidence. How could he ever hope to protect his people, if he was unsure if he could even protect himself? Doubt flooded Hassan's mind, challenging him on every level. It undermined the fragments of the plan he was assembling and threatened to tear it apart. But despite the damage of his confidence, Hassan discovered a sense of peace. He knew there were no struggles through which he must persevere, not only against the threats his people faced, but within himself as well. He survived through a situation he never could have imagined. Even with all his fears and misgivings, Hassan suspected he might be more equipped for these struggles than he gave himself credit for. Despite his doubts and insecurities, he proved more capable of judging the situations than his father. Perhaps, he realized, it was because of those very reservations and not in spite of them that he was capable of coming to more reasonable solutions. Unlike the Kahra, Hassan questioned his assumptions and sought weaknesses in his plans. He accepted his failings and was able to adjust his mindset to accommodate those attributes he might be lacking. Kahra Hassan was certain of the superiority of the Conchogal, and thus didn't question whether his men would return from Inhara. In his mind, there was no chance for failure because he couldn't conceive of a situation in which his warriors could fall. Hassan, however, accepted that the Conchogal warriors were not invincible, especially against a foe such as Azmir. The fact that 2 of their warriors had already fallen to enemy blades gave proof to that. In so many instances in the past few days, his father's overconfidence was his downfall. He acted on faith and not from careful consideration. Perhaps, Hassan realized, that was the very reason Dern believed his son could achieve what the father was incapable of. Was it faith that prevented his father from seeing the obvious risks in the fading world as well? Did he refuse to act because he didn't perceive the slow change as a threat to the Conchogal? It was an interesting notion, and something to keep in mind as he matched wits with the Kahra and the debates to come. However, it was irrelevant at the moment. Hassan could hardly approach the more elusive problem until the clear danger to his people was eliminated. Hassan decided to work with his limitations. His doubt would have to be used to better prepare his strategies. If he knew he might not be able to strike a killing blow when faced with an enemy, then he would use that knowledge as forewarning to plan for such a contingency. If he doubted a plan, he would seek advice. If he could assuage his doubts with forethought and preparedness, he might just be able to accomplish more than he ever thought possible. The climb allowed for more self-reflection than Hassan had ever subjected himself to, but it helped to bring order to the whirling chaos of his thoughts. In those moments of sweat and strain, he gave substance to the vague concepts of his plan, and with new clarity he began assessing the people he would need to enlist. He was consumed by his thoughts as he reached the summit, when an oddity caught his attention. It seemed minor compared to the weighty matters he contended with, but the strangeness of it was so profound he paused in the act of hauling himself over the final ledge. "Are you okay?" Dern reached down to help Hassan, having arrived minutes before the younger man. "It's cool," Hassan muttered, his voice distant as he reconciled his discovery with reality, trying to make the pieces fit. "The stone. It's not warm like it should be." Dern grasped Hassan's belt and hauled him the rest of the way up, then rolled him over to look worriedly into his eyes. The old man began a thorough inspection, checking his temperature and feeling for his pulse. After a moment he sat back on the ground and looked at the boy perplexed. "You seem all right. Maybe a bit dehydrated, but certainly not enough to mistake the stones for anything but hot. Some are borderline blistering in this sun." "Not in the sun," Hassan replied. "Feel underneath." He took Dern's hand and shoved it into the darkened crevice beneath the shelf of stone. He pressed it against the cool surface hidden from the sun's rays. "It's not warm." He watched the old man's reaction, hoping to confirm his own disturbance. "They're always warm, even at night. Why are they cold now?" Dern's face took on a look of consternation as he ran his hands through a few other fissures, finding the same results. "I expected the possibility. Considered it could happen," he muttered up to himself, almost to himself. "But not this soon." What could happen? What's wrong?" "These lands are not like other places at this high of elevation, Hassan. The highlands are unnaturally warm despite factors that should make them otherwise. In most places, the higher you go, the cooler temperatures become. Not here. At the height where mountains are covered in snow, even through summer, we enjoy a warm desert climate. That's in part to the ground itself. Until now, there's always been some unknown source of warmth within the plateaus radiating heat to counter the elevation. But it appears this beneficial oddity, like the rains we once enjoyed, is fading. It's just more of the same, isn't it? The land is dying. Whatever forces sustain the highlands are going away. But why?" That's something we must figure out. Otherwise the tribe may need to learn to use sleds instead of wagons, or leave the highlands altogether, Dern summarized. Sleds? Mode of transportation those who live in snowy regions use. I sometimes forget you've never traveled far beyond the highlands. You're Khan Chagall too, Hassan countered. When have you seen snow, or sleds? I'm very old, young Ka. I've seen many things you could never imagine. Ironic smile. Hassan wasn't satisfied with the answer, but there was a familiar tone to the old man's voice, suggesting the matter wasn't likely to be elaborated on. It always seemed to go that way whenever Hassan approached the topics of Dern's past and his expansive knowledge about the world beyond tribal life. Excuses of age were a frequent dismissal that never gave more than that. This was nothing new with Dern, and was certainly not an issue he expected to get to the bottom of today. He didn't have time to focus on trivial matters such as the old man's eccentricities right now. There isn't really anything we can do about the fading heat, is there? Hassan changed the topic back. Not with all the other problems we have to deal with. I don't think we can begin to solve anything until we know the cause. I have suspicions, certainly, a lot of which can be discussed when I give you that history lesson I mentioned. We'll get to that soon enough, Hassan interrupted him. It drove him a little crazy that the very topic he was anxious to learn about he was now being forced to delay thanks to pressing responsibilities. Despite his rationale, it still irked him that he was so close to enlightenment, but once more denied. There's nothing we can do about any of this until we deal with the current threat, and in order to do that, I have a few things to see to. First, I have to figure out how to get a hold of a couple people without encountering my father. What exactly do you have planned? Dern inquired curiously. Perhaps I can help you work out the kinks. Hassan laid out the rough outlines of his plan. There were numerous details he hadn't fleshed out yet, and Dern was quick to jump on these deficiencies. The old man continually asked questions and made suggestions throughout, helping to fill in the gaps along the way. All in all, he seemed particularly pleased with what Hassan constructed, and where he wasn't, he offered more tenable ideas. By the time they finished their deliberation, they had a cunning start toward setting Hassan up as a counter to his father's missteps. They couldn't overthrow or usurp the Ka-Ra, and hadn't even considered such an attempt, as it was against everything the Khan Chagall held sacred. But through a mix of subtle manipulations and a few minor yet blatant disregards for his father's authority, they devised means for Hassan to achieve his goals while making it difficult for the Ka-Ra to overrule him once begun. Do you think it will work? Hassan stood to stretch his sore muscles. Will it even make a difference? He looked down at the camp where his people went about their duties, completely unaffected by the portentous events overshadowing the tribe's fate. A dying land, an unknown enemy, a leader blinded by ego. All of these factors would be bad enough on their own, but combined, they made for an even greater challenge. Hassan believed he could be their future. He always dreamed of leading the Khan Chagall to greatness. They were a tribe of nomads, with only the dying land beneath their feet and a shared destiny whispered down through the ages, so obscured by time no one really truly understood its meaning anymore. Hassan wasn't even certain if he believed any of it, or even if any of it would help. But something had to be done, and if his father refused to accept the truth of these dangers, it fell to him to take up the cause. Nothing can be certain. Dern came up to stand beside his people. Every plan has the capacity for failure. Every man does as well, but you have a potential for more greatness than most. I believe in the end that fact will prove the vital component. There, Hassan suddenly announced as he pointed down toward a pair of figures on the edges of the camp. Brehon and Jaka. If I can get them, they should be able to gather the others. Where is the Ka-Ra? Dern asked. In the way, unfortunately. Hassan pointed at another pair of figures positioned between their stone perch and Hassan's two friends. I think he and Chagar are arguing about something neither of them looks happy. That's for sure. Arguing or not, he's certain to spot you if you attempt to reach them. Dern began rummaging through his pockets. We'll have to wait, I guess. They can't stand there forever, Hassan conceded. Or we can simply call them to come to us instead. That way we don't risk being seen. I can't exactly yell to them, Hassan argued. I never suggested that, Dern replied in his educating tone. Then what do you... Hassan paused mid-sentence as he spotted the small metallic circle Dern withdrew from his robes. What are you going to do with that? His curiosity took hold. Dern cleaned the strange object on his robes, in between testing its reflective qualities. With a cunning grin, he gestured for Hassan to watch, then focused the beam of sunlight his device produced in the direction of the boys. Hassan saw the glimmer of light as it flashed into Jaka's eyes, but he shielded his face from the glare with his hand. Dern didn't give up, however, and sent the blinding ray to Brehon's eyes. Brehon was a bit cleverer than his large companion, and instead of attempting to shield himself, he searched for the source of the offending light. He looked first at the sun directly above. There was a moment of confusion clear on his face as he tried to deduce how the sun was able to blind him at that angle. But But Dern hadn't given up, and the flashing signal danced back and forth between the two young men in a noticeably abnormal pattern. They looked curiously at the odd flash of light as it wove circles on the ground between them. It was Brehon who eventually figured it out, and looked in their direction. Hassan almost waved, but thought better of it when he considered his friends might wave back and draw unwanted attention. Before he could think of a better signal, Jaka and Brehon started walking straight towards them, a path that led directly past Hassan's father. "How do we stop them?" Hassan blurted out. "If they come this way, my father's going to notice." Dern redirected the beam back into Brehon's eyes, stopping him in his tracks and forcing him to shield them. When the light stopped, he looked up questioningly. Hassan pointed down towards his father and Cho'Gath and shook his head no in hopes it would explain the predicament. Jaka, a bit slower than his friend, didn't catch on and set out again, but Brehon grabbed his shoulder and spoke with visible urgency. Hassan walked to the far side of the outcrop to point where he wished them to approach. Brehon nodded. After explaining it to Jaka, they slipped away from the main encampment and made their way to the rock face Hassan directed them to. It wasn't long before the first of the newcomers pulled himself over the ledge to join Hassan and Dern. Jaka was barely out of breath from the climb. Without a word, he returned back to Brehon, who was just reaching the ledge, and grasped his shoulders with his massive hands. With a tug, he hauled his smaller friend up and over the ledge and deposited him on the ground in front of him with a thump. "Hey!" Brehon protested. "Take your meaty paws off of me, you oaf!" With a quick burst, he leaped to his feet. "What do you think you were doing?" "You're too slow," Jaka grumbled in his deep, gravelly voice. "Ha!" Brehon exclaimed with a slight shrillness to his voice. He always got in these frequent blow-ups. "Me? Slow? That's absurd coming from you. I've seen sand slugs move faster than you." "I beat you, didn't I?" Jaka replied, a self-satisfied look on his face. "It certainly wasn't because you were fast," Brehon argued. "You're so overgrown it took you 10 steps to my 100. He paused, weighing the absurdity of his comment. He apparently found it lacking and continued. "In fact, I can only assume the rock took one look at you and said, 'I give up.' It would rather let you reach the top quick than have your fat, meaty hands fumbling around it on it all day." Jaka gave a deep chuckle. "Little men are funny. Rocks can't talk, Brehon. Even I know that." "You can," Brehon gave in retort, then laughed a little more enthusiastically than the comment actually called for. "Will you two stop it?" Hassan interrupted. "We went through all this trouble to get you up here unseen, and you're both going to get us caught with your bickering." "Very good," Dern commented once the two newcomers had quieted down. "Now that that's finally over—" "Don't count on it," Hassan interjected. "They're always like this." Jaka and Brehon were mere opposites of each other physically. Jaka was immense and heavily muscled. He was to ordinary people what a Dahar was to an ordinary horse, though nowhere near as graceful. He stood more than a hand taller than anyone there, or anyone in the tribe for that matter. His hair was dark, almost black, and his skin was heavily tanned. He had a face that was all blunt features and rounded lines, a squished nose and big dopey eyes. Jaka was all size and strength and very little wit or speed. Brehon, on the other hand, was somewhat small for their tribe. He wasn't abnormally small, he just happened to be slimmer and shorter than his peers, but what he lacked in size and brute force he made up for in speed and agility. And if his feet were quick, his wit and his mouth were quicker. He had a sharp eagle beak of a nose and squinty eyes that made him look like he was always up to something, which he usually was. Add to those differences blonde hair and a lighter complexion, and the two young men side by side created a strange dichotomy. Yet somehow, these two completely dissimilar individuals were nearly inseparable. "So what's this all about?" Brehon asked. "Is there a reason you called us all the way up here?" "I wanted to talk to you both." "Alone," Hassan replied. "I need your help." "Must be something big if you need my help," Brehon remarked. "And the talking rock here, of course." "Keep it up, little man. You can go down a lot quicker than you came up," Jaka grumbled threateningly, though he had a crooked smirk as he said it. "Are you sure these two were your best choices?" Dern asked Hassan critically. "It may not seem so at the moment, but they're exactly what we need," Hassan replied. "They can get the word out without anyone the wiser." "At least they're good for something. They certainly were never good students." "'Cause you were boring, old man," Brehon replied with unabashed humor. "The gods this, the gods that. Some of those stories were good, but all the other stuff just felt like it went on forever." "Other stuff?" Dern questioned, a haughty tone to his voice. "You mean the important stuff, like the history of the world and your people?" "Enough!" Hassan broke in. "We don't have time for all of this." "Your will, Ka-Hassan," Brehon remarked, exaggerating his obedience. Jaka smacked him in the back of the head, almost playfully, but the force was enough to send Brehon stumbling forward several steps. "Show respect, little man. Our Ka needs us." "Thank you, Jaka." Hassan turned an amused grin to Brehon, who was rubbing the almost definite lump forming on his scalp. "If you'll indulge me while I venture into what you might deem boring, I'll explain why I need your help, and what I need from you." He glanced at Brehon, expecting some witty retort, but a single look at Jaka, standing threateningly next to him, silenced anything Brehon may have been considering. The telling of the past day's events went more smoothly than Hassan expected. After the minor pummeling from Jaka, Brehon was on his best behavior, so there was very little interruption. Dern offered a few bits he felt were important, while Hassan gave a basic summation of the main events. They showed great interest in the spy Avar and the battle in Inhara, and a definite skepticism about the Archbishop and his powers. He lost them in the end when he attempted to bridge the topic of the other major threat. After several attempts to convince his friends of the dying lands, Hassan decided those details weren't necessary for the job. Forget about that last part, Hassan capitulated. That's really my problem, at least for now. I need you two to gather any friends who know how to fight. If I'm correct and our men don't return from the city, the entire tribe is going to be left without defenders. How soon do you need them? Brehon asked. His jovial nature suddenly vanished behind a serious demeanor. Get as many as you can in an hour and meet me on the far side of the rock from the camp. If you don't get everyone, don't worry. We can add later on. For now, I just need enough willing to make my point. What are you going to do? Brehon asked. I'm going to get us a weapon and a teacher, Hassan replied. Jaka and Brehon left quickly after that, determined to reach as many people as possible before the allotted time. Everything was a competition for those two, which was partly why Hassan chose them. Their drive to outdo each other would assure there were as many volunteers waiting for him as possible when the deadline arrived. With that part delegated, Hassan moved to the harder part of his plot. Before he could begin, he had to wait patiently for the chance. He watched the camp in silence. Everything hinged on whether his father would follow the usual routine and disappear into the Grand Hall for lunch with the other council members. The current state of affairs meant things might not be so predictable. Time ticked away as his anxiety grew. He had very little time to bring everything together, and it all relied on this task. When Nahima appeared from the Grand Hall and called lunch in her sultry voice, Hassan nearly leaped from the pent-up tension. He breathed a deep sigh of relief when the Ka-Ra joined his counselors and funneled into the large tent. Do you want me to come with you? Dern asked Hassan as Hassan prepared for his descent. I think not. You tend to aggravate him, and I really need him to be compliant right now. Understandable, young Ka. I'll keep things organized at the meeting place for when you arrive. There was no longer as much need for secrecy now that Hassan's father was preoccupied in the Grand Hall, so Hassan descended from his perch and moved into the camp. He'd already located his target from above and moved swiftly to engage him. His mind was frantically composing what to say, while another voice in the back of his mind asserted its doubts. What would he do if he refused? How could he make sure he didn't? Despite his concerns, the truth of the matter came down to one clear fact. It had to be done for the safety of the Khan Cho'Gall. Cho'Gall was seated by one of the supply wagons, sharpening his spear point when Hassan approached. He gnawed on a piece of jerky in between each shrill swipe of metal and whetstone. He rarely ate his lunch within the tent and insisted on only travel rations for any meal he took midday. Thanks to this peculiarity, Hassan was afforded the chance to speak with the arms-master without the father's interference. You look better than last I saw you, Cho'Gall grumbled, without lifting his eyes from his work. Glad to see I don't have to carry you anymore. Yeah, thanks for that. Probably should have hit myself in the head with a softer rock. Cho'Gall looked up from his task at that, then shook his head with a slight chuckle as he returned to it. If you're trying to be accommodating, maybe tie yourself into your saddle too so we don't have to wipe you up off the ground. I'll have to remember that, Hassan feigned sincerity. He expected some snide retort, but none came. There was something off about the arms-master. His banter seemed forced, and there was an unusual tension in him that made itself clear in his demeanor. Cho'Gall was often bound taut like a coiled spring, waiting to burst into action, but this was different. He appeared weighted down by some burden. Whatever debates he had with the Ka-Ra earlier in the day seemed likely culprits. The arms-master rarely disagreed with his father, but Hassan had seen their faces marred by discontent. If there was contention between the two, then there was an opening Hassan could exploit. You're worried about the men we sent back, aren't you? The metallic whine suddenly stopped. Cho'Gall didn't look up. He sat frozen for a moment as if the weight of his burden had suddenly crushed him under. Hassan had never seen him like this. He was abrasively gruff and emotionally aloof on a good day, but this strange pensiveness was disconcerting. Hassan was uncertain how best to harness Cho'Gall's distress without antagonizing him. It was a thin line to walk, but Dern's lesson had prepared him well. At least he hoped they had. He made a mistake, Hassan began. It was a bold move, but with a warrior like Cho'Gall, it seemed like the best course. There was a possibility his mark could elicit an immediate defense of the Ka-Ra's actions out of the arms-master's unwavering loyalty. But the criticism had to be made, so Hassan's plan to fix the error could be accepted. We made a mistake, Cho'Gall corrected, his voice stone-cold. I gave him my support in this. He absently set the spear aside and moved on to sharpening a dagger drawn from his belt. Men are going to die because of that. A lot of men. Likely all of them. We can't change that now, Hassan responded directly, and it does no one any good to sulk about it. The glare he received in return was fierce and challenging. While the look in his eyes was chilling, the passion and heat awoken in them were what Hassan was after. He didn't need a man broken by failure, but a warrior determined to persevere despite that failure. What we can do is prepare for whatever comes next. The Ka-Ra refuses to act before he hears word from the party he sent, Cho'Gah replied with a hint of animosity, or until we are certain there is no one left to report. I expected as much, but just because he chooses not to act doesn't mean that as Ka, I can't. And what will you do, little Ka? He snapped derisively. That was the moment Hassan was waiting for. Up until this point, Cho'Gah had seen him as a child, as simply the son of the Ka-Ra. And he only afforded Hassan a meager amount of respect for that, but it was time to make him acknowledge his title as Ka, for that was the only way this plan would work. Hassan needled his pride and awoke his scorn to elicit just such a show of disrespect, and it was time to call him to task for it. Is this the honor you grant your Ka? Hassan challenged in stern tone. Is this respect you would give to the heir to the Ka-Ra? Is this what your sworn oaths to my lineage amount to? The inflection of anger in his words grew with every question, and each word struck the arms-master like a blow. Cho'Gah's eyes aflame and wounded by the words leaped to his feet. I honor the line of the great Ayun Ka, he insisted, fiercely, then appeared to catch himself and restrain his anger. His voice took a softer tone. Please, my Ka, excuse my disrespect. I dishonored you and ask what I must do to redeem myself in your eyes. If you wish to prove your loyalty to my line and our people, then help me protect them. How would you have me do this? My Ka, I cannot rescind my support of our folly, and I cannot go against your father's wishes. I would never ask for you to disobey my father. Nothing I request will require such. Hassan paused to assess the man. There was anger still brewing, but there was also a part that seemed to want redemption. The Ka-Ra hadn't provided a chance for that. But Cho'Gah now saw the potential from his Ka. Our defenders were sent to their death, Hassan concluded. Could some return? Possibly, but every hour that passes it makes it less possible. Without those spears, we're vulnerable. I saw your face when we found those tracks of the abandoned camp, Cho'Gah. You sensed the threat from Avar as clearly as I did. Do you deny that threat now that we must proceed unprotected? I believe as you do now. It was a mistake to let him go. We may pay for that in the days to come, Cho'Gah admitted, but there's little we can do about that now. You can arm others and train them to protect us. I know people willing to take up the spear and defend our people. I just need you to provide them with weapons and training. You mean Jaka and Brehon? Cho'Gah asked. Yes, I saw you sneaking around with them up there. You ask me to give weapons to children, then? Your father is sure to refuse such an act. Would my father really deny me the dignity of a personal honor guard, to march with me into the Dahara? It would seem petty to deny such a trivial thing, wouldn't it? Not to mention the prestige it would gain me before the other leaders. Clever, Hassan. You're right. It would seem silly for your father to object, but cleverness won't grant a few children the ability to protect our people. It's a futile move. If my request is so minor, and you agree there's no reason for my father to object, then what need is there to refuse? Hassan set the hook for the trap he so carefully constructed. Very well, my Ka. I'll arm your honor guard and train a few children. Does this absolve me of my disrespect? We shall see, Hassan replied smartly. Follow me. I want things started as quickly as possible. Before your father catches a hint of what you're up to? Cho'Gah muttered with a smirk. Perhaps, Hassan smiled, then led Cho'Gah through the empty encampment. The majority of the tribe was in the grand hall eating lunch, but there was an oddly noticeable absence of anyone around. Of course, now. One sec. His mind wrestled with the critiques the arms master presented during their confrontation. Was that all he would accomplish? Arming a couple kids? What if no one showed up? Well, he could rely on Jaka and Brehon. He had a somewhat precarious relationship with the rest of his peers. There was every likelihood those who would be the only volunteers at the meeting place. Were that to happen, Hassan would lose any chance of respect from Cho'Gah and likely any chance of effecting the changes he hoped to bring about. His stomach churned as he second-guessed the timing and planning of his move. The tension grew as they rounded the stone outcrop, but as the volunteers came into view, his heart leaped up into his chest. Every boy in the tribe between the ages of 14 and 19 appeared to have heeded the call. There were close to 30 young men grouped behind Jaka and Brehon, who stood there with self-satisfied grins. Hassan was speechless by the surprising show of support, and Cho'Gath appeared caught off guard. Dern smiled and approached from amid the throng. "Do you think you can supply enough weapons for our men, Arms Master?" he asked without a hint of flippancy. "You're behind this, aren't you, old man?" Cho'Gath accused as his ingrained reaction to Dern came to the fore. "While I appreciate the assertion that I'm clever enough to bring such a thing about, old boy, it turns out your Ka is rather resourceful when it comes down to it. I merely did as we all must do for the tribe. I offered my services, as it appears you've done as well." Cho'Gath looked around at those gathered in disbelief, then turned to the young man beside him. "Your father underestimates you, Hassan. You're far more clever and daring than either of us guessed." "I only hope it's enough." Hassan's reply bore the sudden weight of the lives gathered before him. If any of these boys died, it would be on him, for he was the one handing them weapons and calling them to stand before their enemies. In fact, the lives of all of his people were riding on his shoulders now. Somehow he must find a way to protect them from Aasimar, Avar, and the very land dying beneath their feet. Hassan was astonished everything went as well as it did. After enlisting every able-bodied young boy in the tribe and convincing his father's most trusted advisor to train them, he expected an immediate backlash. The title of warrior among the Conchogal was sacred. A boy must train from manhood until the age of 20 before being allowed to take up the spear, yet weapons were distributed without incident. They even began basic drills for those volunteers who didn't share the same weapons experience as Hassan or his friends. As the hours passed and the training continued, a few onlookers gathered to investigate. There were looks of disapproval, but they were outnumbered by those who gave encouragement. A sense of unease hung over the tribe from the absence of their protectors. The spectators who offered support took heart in what they saw. The sight of these men taking up arms calmed their insecurity with the assurance that, should no one return from the mission, they wouldn't be left vulnerable. One onlooker, however, gave nothing away in his hard stare. The Ka appeared without warning after the majority of the day had passed. He stood watching from the edge of the training grounds, not uttering a word. No action was taken to prevent the training, and no one, in turn, made an effort to approach the chieftain. But when Hassan met that cold glare, the Ka turned abruptly and left. He was about to follow when Cho'Gath caught his arm and stopped him. "I'll deal with this," the arms master told him. "But what do I do with them?" Hassan asked. "They're yours, my Ka. I only agreed to train them. They're your honor guard. Lead them." With a nod, he assured Hassan he had his full confidence, and he was gone to face off with his friend and chieftain. It caught Hassan off guard to have the arms master show such faith in him, and for a moment he was unable to react. Then a voice from his guard called to him with full title, "Ka Hassan," and the reality of it came crashing in. He was their leader now. For so long he was simply the chieftain's son, the future Ka. But that honor was something yet to come, never an honor he held at the time. That was all changed now. He was still Ka as he had always been, but as he looked out at the expectant faces, he realized he had, at last, become their Ka. Past training with Cho'Gath provided valuable lessons, and Hassan used those now to direct the session. Dern helped, but surprisingly, the true assistance came from Jaka and Brehon. Both intended to take up the spear once they were old enough, and were well trained like Hassan. So they were versed in the practice drills. They moved through the ranks, correcting and encouraging as they went, and showed a surprising amount of maturity, yet despite their mannered performance, they still managed to execute a scheme right in front of Hassan without his notice. It wasn't the usual style of tactic. Instead, their plotting left their Ka taken aback for a second time that day. When the day's training was done, the weapons sheathed and the recruits prepared to depart, Jaka and Brehon took up positions on each side of the group. Hassan regarded them questioningly, unsure why everyone stood silently in place. Then the joined voices of his two friends boomed out in unison, "Honor to your Ka!" They thrust their fisted hands over their heart in salute. Like rolling thunder, the voices of his honor guard joined as one, "Honor to our Ka!" as they saluted Hassan with fists over heart. "Ka Hassan! Ka Hassan! Ka Hassan!" The echoing call drew startled looks from the camp and made clear to all that the boy, who once shirked his duties and hid from responsibility, was no more. In his place was a leader of the Conchogal. In his place was a Ka. Whether he was able to prove worthy of that title was still in question, but as his people looked upon him there were new expectations. Out of the corner of his eye he could see the pleased grins of Jaka and Brehon, who likely masterminded the spectacle for just that purpose. "Thank you," Hassan thought silently to himself. "I only hope I'm able to prove myself deserving of such honors." They were still waiting patiently for a response, so he gave the fisted salute in return and dismissed his honor guard. With a cheer they broke off in different directions. Excitement and looks of pride filled their young faces as they returned to the camp. Amid the commotion, the soft call of a woman's voice beckoned the tribe to dinner.